This is Spare Time Repair, and this is a Teac PD 500 compact disc player. I'm almost embarrassed to make this video because I recently made quite a fuss about the fact that I'd finally found a thrift store single disc CD player and a vintage 1987 model to boot. Well, just over a week later I found another one, and this one's even older, hailing from 1985. And if the Sanyo badge on the other player didn't immediately excite me, this Teac one certainly does. But before I get too carried away, there's a lot of work to do to get this one back in service. The tray will accept a disc, but table of contents reading is intermittent. Press play and it shows signs of life, but the counter suggests that the laser is skipping. The commonly used buttons feel spongy, not having the tactile click of the lesser used ones, especially the skip forward button, which is only responsive 50% of the time. I can't even hook it up to my amplifier, because the RCA output jacks are mysteriously missing their grounding plate. On the plus side, the player is reassuringly heavy and has a brushed aluminium fascia. Overall, it's a classy looking machine that I'd love to get working again. I paid about $18 for this with taxes. Already I'm getting quite a strong smell of cigarettes, and that might explain the problems with the laser. It could be a film of nicotine over the lens. So I'm going to plug it in again. Let's press eject. So we've got a ramped gear here that's lifting the disc clamp up and down. We've got that same system where the disc clamp drops the disc down via these two pegs here. So first thing we're going to do is remove this clamp. Okay, it was on quite a powerful spring. It might be hard to tell, but that laser lens does look a little bit cloudy. This whole transport is really hefty when you compare it to modern ones, which are a fraction of this size. I'm going to give this lens a clean. Bit of grime on there. I'm not sure whether that was off the lens or the surround of it. The first time I put a disc in this player, it wouldn't read the table of contents at all. Then the next time it did, so I'm not sure whether that's an issue with the laser or the sled getting stuck. Well, I certainly need to remove the transport, so let's try and remove the disc tray. So I think this gear has to come off. And I think I remember its orientation. But this still won't slide out. I think there's something under this front end that's catching. You can see there's a little white nylon post sticking up that's stopping it coming out. So I think it's catching on here. See, there's a crack running across this part, but I don't think that's a problem. Somehow I forgot to record the part where I removed the tray, but I did just have to press down on this nylon piece here. Here's the underside of the tray. So this is the leaf switch that's operated by this cam. Looks like that's got to come out. So I guess these 4 screws are going to release the transport. Nope, it's still not moving. 2 screws underneath and 1 in the middle here. So perhaps I need to remove those as well. I'm going to leave that middle one in for now because it might not need to come out. So it's going all the way through. Yes, that looks like it's released it. That other screw is just this rubberized post to give it a bit more support. Well, this is definitely the beefiest CD transport I've ever seen. We've got some adjustment pots on the end here. So we've got focus gain, track offset, track gain, and FE offset. Hopefully we won't need to play with those. It'd be nice to disconnect this whole thing from the main unit. Looks like everything's socketed. These rubber shock mounts still feel pretty good. Alright, so this is where that cam was mounted. And there's a motor for that directly. So there's no belt for the eject mechanism, which explains why it's still working. I'm trying to decide whether I want to remove this or not. I think I can probably work with it in situ. I'm going to remove these 2 screws, see if I can get under this mechanism. Nope, that hasn't helped. Yeah, these 2 motors have got screws going through the top, and there's another 2 underneath the spindle plate here. So I think those would need to be removed before this PCB at the bottom would come off. I think I need to do that. Or maybe not, because I can move the sled manually by turning this. It feels very smooth. I was imagining these rails would be sticky and that's why it wasn't moving smoothly and skipping. It doesn't look like that's the case. There's some brown marks on these plugs here. But I think that's just come up through this hole here, so maybe it was sat on something warm. I don't think that's any component burning out or anything. I'm not sure if I gain a lot from removing this PCB, but it would give me better access to the rails, so probably should. So hopefully this spindle plate will just lift off. Oh, I think I've got away with that. So now I can remove these 2 screws. I'm holding the PCB from underneath because it might drop down. It's catching on here, so I need to remove this as well. Probably why this has got little wings on it, so you can lever it off without damaging the teeth. So this should now drop down. I'm going to disconnect this because it's stopping it from moving far enough. In fact, it might be easier to remove it from the other end. This is a limit switch. Right, so now we've got pretty good access to the sled rail. So I'm going to remove these screws at either end. So I need to move it to the middle. I've spotted what might be a problem. This rack gear here is split on its mounting bracket. There's a crack right across there. I mean, it doesn't appear to be affecting its operation, but if that's moved its position slightly, then that could account for the laser mistracking. This does appear to be moving very freely. Yeah, there's a crack across here as well. You might be able to see that one a bit better. It still feels pretty solid. Rather than trying to remove this rail, I think I'm just going to grease it up as best I can because I don't want to put any more stress on that rack. Could try and clean off the old grease first. It's going to apply some silicone grease. Well, I don't think that was even the problem. These motors don't feel sticky either. I'm going to put a drop of oil in the end. I'm sure they're all fine. I'm going to reattach this limit switch and put it back together. Spray some contact cleaner for good measure. Just need to refit this disc clamp. Right, I think we're ready to test whether that's made any difference. I'm using a CD that would have been available in 1985. Okay, well, it's read the table of contents first time, so I can't hook this up to the amp because there's problems with the RCA jacks, but it does have a headphone socket, so let's see if it actually plays. No. It's spinning, but it's... yeah, now it's given up. So it's strange that it can read the disc, but it can't play it. Yeah, it's just not having any of it. So I don't think it's a problem with the sled getting stuck, but might it be a problem with the focus? Because surely if the laser's reading the table of contents, then it can't be that the laser has failed. Problem is the trimmer pot for the laser focus is underneath this mechanism somewhere. I'm wondering whether it's accessible if I remove the front panel. I tried looking for the service manual for this. There are paper copies on eBay, but they would cost more than the unit itself cost me. So I'm going to take these screws out and see if I can take the front fascia off. Yes. So after removing the front panel, we have indeed got access to these trimmer pots. Here's the rest of it. Just wondering about those spongy buttons. They don't feel too bad here. I think it's more the buttons themselves. So it seems to be reading the table of contents every time now. So I'm going to put a mark on this potentiometer at the 6 o'clock position. That way I'll know I'll be able to get back to what it was. I mean, this is a shot in the dark, really. I can't see why the focus gain would drift. So I'm going to press play. And I'm gently turning it. I'll go the other way. It's given up, so I'm going to try again. Now I'm going back clockwise. In fact, it won't go any further than that. Let's see whether it reads the table of contents again. Yeah, it does, and it does it very quickly. It just sounds like it's struggling to find where it should be going. So I did a little bit of research, and obviously the focus gain isn't making any difference. TR gain, I think, is tracking gain, which may make a difference, but my instinct is still that it's something more mechanical than a fault with the laser itself. Someone suggested that it could be the clamp, like where it clamps the spindle, that it might not be letting it spin very well. I think that's unlikely, but it's worth trying before I start messing around with anything more delicate. So we have got a little ball bearing in here, and this grease has gone very hard, so it's definitely worth replacing that. Can't see that being the issue, but we might as well do it. Well, it might cause some skipping, but I can't see that stopping it playing altogether, but we'll try it anyway. No. Alright, I'm going to try adjusting the tracking gain just to see if anything improves. Nope, that did nothing, so I've adjusted it back to where it was. Of course, it could be completely non-repairable. It could be a problem with a chip that's not telling the motor to do the right thing, or maybe the laser's strong enough to read the table of contents, but playing is just too much. There are 3 capacitors on this board. It's possible they've gone bad. Not sure whether that would cause the issue. Wondering if I can remove those capacitors without taking this whole board out. I'm going to try and measure these capacitors. Well, they're rated at 100 microfarads, so it's not miles off. I wonder if that ESR is a little high though. I wonder what I'd find under this cover. So I think the laser is in here. It fires its beam here, hits this 45-degree mirror. There's another mirror here, which can adjust for tracking focus, and then it shines out of the lens cover and obviously hits the disc. So I've managed to remove the laser assembly complete. I'm not sure it really helps. Well, I'm really in deep now. I've disassembled part of the optical assembly. This is the lens that goes in front of the laser before it hits the mirror. I'm sure you better see this, but there is a little bit of cloudiness on there. It's definitely not clean. So that's a lot cleaner now. I think all you can do is eliminate as many potential faults as possible. At least if it still doesn't work, you know you've done your best. There is another potentiometer on this side here. That one's labelled HF gain. And there's another one in here that hasn't got a yellow plastic front. I just wonder if I spray all of these with contact cleaner, like if they've got crusty, even if they haven't moved, would that create problems? So I'm going to spray them all up, then mark their positions, and then just twist them a bit to clean them internally. I guess spray them before I mark them because I think the spray might wipe the pen off. I'm just trying to cover all my bases really. The one on the laser pickup module might be the laser strength adjustment. I think that's really a last resort. I've just been checking capacitors, and there's 2 on this board that are giving me bad readings in circuit, and a couple of these ones don't look great, so I think I'm just going to replace them all. I mean, they're good caps, they're Rubicon, but they're 40 years old. I removed the 3 capacitors from the laser module, and out of circuit they were all testing fine. The 2 capacitors I removed from this board, one of them was testing fine, but this one says it's leaky. So I'm going to replace that one, and all the others might as well just go back in. I know these ones are old, but they're probably still better than the cheap Amazon ones I got in a massive box. Well, that's all the capacitors replaced, and without going crazy and checking every component on the board, I think that's about all I can do for now. So I'm going to get it all reassembled and see if it's made any difference. My expectations are suitably low. Well, that's not encouraging. We're back to not even reading the table of contents. But I may have disturbed something when I was messing with the optical pickup assembly. So perhaps the focus tracking needs adjusting. Or the focus, what was it? Focus gain? Feels like it's trying to do something. It's amazing that these are so finely tuned. Or maybe I've just completely screwed it up. Well, it's now the next day. It's about 2:30 in the afternoon. I've been working on this all morning and it's still not working. I can't tell you how many times I've had this apart, tweaked things, put it back together. I feel like I've tried just about everything. I've tweaked all the potentiometers at the front, backwards and forwards, trying different combinations, and I still can't get it to even read the table of contents. In doing all of this, I've also introduced new problems that I've had to resolve. It's just been a very frustrating process. It's now day 3 of my Teac Odyssey, and I've bitten the bullet and ordered the service manual. It might be a waste of time, but it would bug me if I didn't try. But while I'm waiting for that, I've been continuing to tinker with it, and I've potentially found something. As you know, I checked these capacitors and they were all okay, but there's a ceramic capacitor on this side, and that's not measuring right in circuit. But I thought it was worth taking it off and seeing how it measures out of circuit. Nope, that's another dead end. Out of circuit it's measuring absolutely fine. It's meant to be 22 nanofarads, and that's exactly what it is. I've just had a mini breakthrough. I put everything back together after removing that capacitor, which I refitted, by the way. Tried it again, and for the first time since I first disassembled this machine, it's now reading the table of contents again. So if I press the eject button and then toggle the leaf switch, well, now it isn't. I swear, just now, the table of contents came up. But that gives me hope that I haven't damaged the laser, or the laser is still capable of doing something. But anyway, I was close to writing this off. Now I've got just a small amount of hope. Well, it's now day 4, and rather than aimlessly twiddling pots, I thought I'd do a bit of research. And at the risk of making this video a bit too long, I wanted to share some of what I found out. Most of it came from an excellent post on a blog called Yesterware from 2020 by a guy who's been repairing optical drives for over 10 years. It's a really good read, so I'll put a link to it in the description. And although he's coming at it from a games console point of view, I think the advice is more than valid for CD players as well. The biggest takeaway was that increasing the power of the laser by adjusting a potentiometer is always a bad idea. He makes the analogy of having a problem with your car, say your brakes are binding and slowing you down, and tweaking the laser power is a bit like just slamming harder on the accelerator to overcome it. It might work, but you're just treating the symptom, not the cause. Now, because he's primarily replacing consoles, the lasers he's dealing with aren't going to be anywhere near as old as this one. And so that certainly needs to be acknowledged, but I think it makes sense, because the laser potentiometer is only there to calibrate it in the factory and to compensate for the variability in the other components. So logically, any issue the laser is having, especially after 40 years of use, could easily be down to components drifting out of spec. You saw earlier that the Rubicon caps were testing okay, but I don't see any harm in replacing them, so I've ordered some decent quality Panasonic ones of the same value. Another thing that blog post warned against was not cleaning off the old grease before applying new grease, and also applying too much grease to these sled rails. And I was certainly guilty of both of those. So while I'm waiting for the capacitors to arrive, I'm going to remove this rail and clean it off completely. Well, interestingly, there's a hair underneath here that I didn't spot before. Was that causing a little bit of friction? There's another small hair on there as well. I've cleaned all the grease off this rail, and I'm cleaning inside these runners as well with no grease at all. That feels better already. There's almost no friction now. It's possible there was never any grease on there and I just introduced a problem. Incidentally, there's a little adjustment screw here. There's a tiny dot on the underside, and that's where it runs in this channel here, and it just adjusts the angle, because there's a little bit of play like this, and it just lets you adjust how the laser is sitting. I tried adjusting that when I was trying to get it to read the table of contents, and it had no effect, so I've put it back to where it was, but it's yet another thing that can be adjusted. That does feel a lot smoother. Finally, 2 days late, my new capacitors are here. I've already removed the old ones, so I'm just going to apply a little bit of flux. There are 2 capacitors on this board that have the same value, so I'm going to replace those 2. So once again, I'm going to reassemble and see if that solved the problem. Okay, will we have a table of contents? No. Well, I still have some hope. The service manual is on its way, should come in the next day or 2. But I must say I was hoping those capacitors would make the difference. But at least I'm confident now there's no issue with the sled, and mechanically things appear to be okay. It's now Monday afternoon, and it's been an interesting weekend. On Friday afternoon, the service manual finally arrived, and although I balked at paying $20 for it, it was actually worth every cent. Initially I was worried I wouldn't be able to do any of the adjustments because most of them require the disc to be playing, and obviously it wasn't doing that. But there were a couple I could do, and I was ticking them off. I had to adjust this potentiometer slightly, but the main one was the laser output. And although I said I didn't intend to change that, when I measured it according to this formula here, it was much less than it should have been. So it took me a while to figure this out, but it says that you need to multiply the rating of the laser by 2.2, and then that's what the voltage across it should be. Well, the example I give here is a laser rated at 0.356 milliamps. Mine was actually rated at 0.155, so when you multiply that by 2.2, it came out at 0.341 volts. My laser was about 2.4 volts, so I had to increase it quite considerably. And after I did that and tinkered with a couple more of the pots, it started reading discs. But the other big adjustment was the tracking screw, and that is the hexagonal screw at the bottom of the laser module. And to adjust that, you had to short across a couple of points here and then read from another point with the multimeter and then go for the highest possible voltage across it. And the adjustment is so fine that 1 degree either side, it just refused to play, but in the sweet spot, it actually started working. There were some adjustments I couldn't do. The kick gain adjustment was one of them, because on the diagram it shows there being a variable resistor there. On my board it's just a fixed resistor, so there was nothing I could do about that. A couple of these others required a band pass filter, which I don't have. There's a couple more adjustments here that need to be done using an oscilloscope, so I thought I would do those ones on camera, but in the meantime I will prove that it is actually working. So let's do the eject cycle. You can see it has read the disc. The display is very dim in this bright light, and hopefully you can pick up on the mic that it is playing. But it isn't perfect. It won't play CDRs. It will read them but won't play them at all. And one of my press CDs, it won't play very well either. So I'm hoping a bit more tinkering will overcome that. It's also very susceptible to bumps. If you tap it, it will skip, which it shouldn't do really. But again, that might be resolvable with some more tinkering. But in the meantime, I'm going to get the oscilloscope out and make those final 2 adjustments. Okay, this one is the high frequency level adjustment. Has to be done while the disc is playing. And I've got the mechanism propped up because I need to adjust this potentiometer under here. So I'm probing this point here, which is what it says to do. And on the scope, we should get a pattern like this. That is 2 volts peak to peak. And my oscilloscope is a bit dodgy, but we have got 2 volts. I'm currently on 1 volt per division, so that's more or less correct. So I'm going to adjust this potentiometer and see if I can make that pattern any clearer. I think the answer is no. That's about as good as I can get it. And the final adjustment is the azimuth. And it just says turn the azimuth screw to make the eye pattern the best. Well, the azimuth screw is this one in here. Well, that doesn't seem to be making much difference, so it looks like that's as good as it's going to get. Well, I think I've done all I can on the playback side of things, so now I need to address the other issues. And I'm going to replace all these momentary switches at the bottom here, probably also the open close button as well. And then I need to replace the RCA output jacks, which is this part here. And I'm hoping those old ones will come out quite easily. I was going to use the jacks out of my old dead mini disc deck, but I forgot that these ones are doubles. So I suppose I could still cut it down the middle. Because the bottom panel comes off the CD player, I'm hoping I can remove the old one without having to take out the motherboard. Well, I've removed both the sockets, and the center pins actually line up pretty well. But annoyingly they're reversed. You have left at the top and right at the bottom, and if I soldered them in like this it would be the other way around, right and left. So I'm now wondering whether I can just remove the shielding and slip that over the top of this one. Then I could just make a connection between here and the center pin here. That way I could maintain the screw holes and make it a good solid connection. I've got the ground shield off the other socket and it slides over perfectly, but there's a gap. It doesn't slide back far enough. So you can see it's a bit recessed. But even with that gap, if you plug it in, the center pin does still make contact. I should check that's the same with the bottom one as well. Yeah, so I'm thinking I can use the little discs that were out of the other plug, use those to make up the difference, and then I'll get coloured sockets as well. Well, predictably the white one is a bit thick, so it won't go back as far as it needs to. So I'll have to sand a bit off that. And the red one, because the outside was plastic, is built in. So I'm going to have to cut a little bit off the end here. In fact, to save myself the hassle of cutting this off, I'm just going to use the other white one and colour it red. I sanded the discs a little thinner by just rubbing them in a circular motion on some sandpaper. and a coloured one in using a red Sharpie. And I was going to wrap this piece around the edge here and connect it to the ground on the back, but I think that looks a bit ugly. And because there's a hole in the centre here, and I also noticed there are holes in here going from front to back, I'm going to pass a piece of wire through here. I've ground out a little channel, so I'm going to bend that down, and I can snap this off and just solder it there where the hole is. So there's our wire poking through the front, and it goes right through the back and soldered onto this ground pin. And I don't have a lot of clearance to get this in position, so I think I'm going to solder the front plate on after I've soldered the main part into the board. That's now soldered in. I've checked all the connections and they're all fine, and I just brushed a bit of glue on the plastic posts before I pushed the shield on, so hopefully that'll hold. I unscrewed the front control panel, and it gives you very good access for the button replacement. And I was going to use these ones off this old board, but I'd forgotten that these have long stalks, so they're not actually going to be any good. Also, they've only got 2 solder connection points, whereas these have 4. So instead I'm going to give them a good spray with contact cleaner and just work them a few times, and if that doesn't help, then I can always order some new ones. I'm also going to give this front fascia a good clean, and then I can reassemble everything and give it a final test. Well, I've removed every single button from the front panel, and they all have an individual spring. You can also see some of them have quite a dust build-up on them, and that's just why they're getting stuck and jammed sometimes. Well, an awful lot has happened since I filmed that last section. I cleaned up the faceplate. That's now looking really good, and all the buttons feel much better than they did. But before I refitted it, I thought I'll just have another go at tweaking the player to get it playing a little bit better, because it was just occasionally glitching. So I was tweaking the potentiometers, and the one that was having the most effect was the FE offset, which I thought was focus error offset, but the service manual says it's feed error. Anyway, I adjusted that so it was nearly right, but it was at the end of its travel. I couldn't adjust it anymore, and it felt like if I could just go a little bit further, it would solve the problem. So then I thought, well, what if I swapped it out for a potentiometer with more range? So as an experiment, I wired in this potentiometer, which is an old volume control of something else. Obviously, I removed the old one first, and I tweaked that, and it worked. There were no more glitches. It was playing perfectly. It was reading discs quickly. It was skipping to different tracks quickly. I was really happy. Everything was good. And then I was curious as to what the resistance reading was on here, because this was pretty much at the end of its travel too. And so I put the multimeter across it, and it was reading basically 0 ohms, pretty much a dead short between the 2 red wires. And so rather naively, I thought, if there's a short across there, then do I even need the potentiometer? If it's happy playing like that, what if I just connect the red wires and do away with this altogether? And so I did that, and I turned it back on, and it died. Completely died. There was no display, no disc spin, nothing. It was like it was unplugged. So obviously I removed that short, I put the potentiometer back in, but it was still dead. And so I felt like I'd grasped defeat from the jaws of victory. I then spent much of yesterday afternoon probing the board, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I still had voltage in some areas, but not others. And so I worked from the transformer, the power supply connections, across the bridge rectifier, just trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And finally, I found a couple of burnt out transistors. So I've removed all the transistors around the power supply, found a couple of candidates that I think will serve as replacements. And now I'm going to solder them all back in and hopefully resurrect it. Okay, I've soldered in the new transistors. I really hope that's fixed it. Oh, thank God. That is such a relief. Will it still read the disc? No, but it might just need a bit more tweaking. Well, those tweaks have been made and we're finally back together. For the second time, in fact. The first time the skip forward button wasn't working, so I did have to replace that in the end. But now I think we are finally done. And it's been a bit of an ordeal, this one. I've been working on this on and off for almost 3 weeks now. I reckon I've put over 40 hours into it, and I'll be glad to see the back of it, to be honest. Let's just prove that it is working. I've got it hooked up to my amplifier. So those new RCA jacks are working fine. So yeah, all seems to be good. So will I be using this as my main player? Well, no. It's still a bit finicky, it's still not playing CDRs, and that other album I mentioned it was having trouble with, it's still not happy with for some reason. Perhaps if I had all the proper calibration tools I could get over that, but for now I think this is the best I can do. Also, it's got some weird quirks that I'm not really keen on. When you insert the disc, it says the total disc time, but that then disappears and there's no way to get it back again, unless you eject and reinsert the disc. So you might think pressing remain time would bring it up, but no, nothing happens there. In fact, when you're playing a track, I'll just turn the volume down. Normally, when you press remain time, you would expect to see the remaining time of the track. But instead it gives the remaining time of the whole album, which is odd, and it doesn't even cycle through. It just goes back to the current time. When you press stop, it stops at the current track, it doesn't go back to the beginning. So if I were to press play again, it would resume from the start of track 3. So that, and the fact that it's a little bit picky with the discs it plays, means that I probably won't be using this, but it was satisfying to clean it up and get it running again. Anyway, I hope that was enjoyable. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.